What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the disappointing games I reviewed in 2025, which may seem just a tiny bit early, but truth be told, I was looking ahead to the things I have planned for the rest of the last couple of months of the year here, and I noticed that I had actually played, at least in some form, pretty much all of them besides Octopath Traveler 0, and given a relatively recent release, I was reminded of some games that were a bit under par, let's say, as we move into this, and so I thought it was a good time for me, at least, to make this video. But as usual with this kind of thing, I always like to mention at the beginning that oftentimes what you find disappointing or what exceeds your expectations are down to those expectations in particular. The mindset with which you approach a game has a pretty big impact on your enjoyment of it. Though that's not always an individual's fault, oftentimes this can be a failure in terms of marketing, trying to present something for a game that just kind of doesn't really live up to what it actually is, that kind of thing. And that's pretty much a guarantee to lead to some feelings of disappointment. So keep that in mind, I suppose, as we move through this, as there are a few games on this list that I think are perfectly fine, even good in some cases, but portions of them for one reason or another felt lacking for me personally, which is what they're doing on this list, of course. And then last but not least, before we dive fully into this, this is just games I have reviewed this year. A couple of them did not release this year, or they saw a PC release this year, so there is a little bit of wiggle room there. Otherwise, though, let's go ahead and dive fully into this, and we're kicking it off first with Visions of Mana. This is a game that technically released in 2024, but I personally did not get around to playing it until right at the very end of December, and so it was kind of what I kicked the year off with. Now, Visions of Mana is an odd one because it does a lot of things that I enjoyed quite a bit, but just to dive straight at the point of it, there were two problems with this game for me. The main one really was that the story just kind of falls off a cliff at a certain point. It takes a turn that is, in my opinion, very silly, to the point of kind of ruining a really good story otherwise. And despite the sort of cutesy graphics, it's a game that leans fully into the concept of human sacrifice and stuff. And unfortunately, I feel like they dropped the ball in part of it, which really ate into my own enjoyment. And then that on top of the fact that some of the scaling and power progression just felt a little off. I believe I mentioned this in my review, but there was a point where I had gotten up to level 30 or 40 or something like that through the progression of the game, and then randomly in an hour I gained 40 levels. And as a result, honestly, just all of the pieces of the puzzle never quite fit together quite right, which is why I felt that Visions of Mana was a bit disappointing despite all the love for the Mana series, of course. Though in a somewhat similar vein, the next game I want to talk about is actually the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake, another game that released in 2024 technically, but that I personally did not get to until the beginning of this year, as the Dragon Quest franchise is pretty legendary in its own right, and that is, of course, of interest to me. And while, despite it being on this list, I did actually enjoy most of it, but Dragon Quest III in particular starts to really burst at the seams towards the end. And it is, again, a twofold problem where, at the time of its release anyway, the Monster Wrangler, which is a job that they added to this remake in particular, was just so overpowered compared to everything else that it was the only common sense thing you'd really want to use. And it was to the point where the super boss at the end you'd basically beat by spamming one move from this job. However, to get to that super boss, you then have to slog through the dungeon that they added to the end of it, which was actually new to the remake. That was kind of awful, to be honest. So it was two different trials in particular that I'm talking about, where you have to bring a party that can use a specific type of weapon in order to deal any damage at all and not get immediately obliterated. The problem with that being that thanks to the game's job system, you can't just equip those weapons and be good to go. You have to go equip a job that will let you use those weapons, but that resets your experience, which means you have to level that character back up, which you're then going to have to switch them out and do the exact same thing again for the other dungeon because they make you do this twice. And then chances are when you're done with that, you're likely going to want to restore your party to what you were actually doing, which is going to make that a whopping 3 times in a row. And it's honestly just not fun. And that part is still kind of in the game. Now, the other part I want to mention is something they actually patched a little bit. So they did actually nerf the Monster Wrangler and then at the same time rebalance some other abilities to make them a little better. So the Monster Wrangler is still very strong, but it's a little more reined in now. However, on the monster side of things, Something that happened in the in-game of this remake is that all of the enemies would all together spam you with entire party-wide AoE stuns. So you would fight like 3 or 4 different monsters, and every single one of them would spam a stun for your entire party, and it would just kind of be luck of the draw whether or not that actually hit you or not, which is why some of the stuff like abusing the Monster Wrangler spam was the route you were likely to go, because these fights were just incredibly monotonous otherwise. And for an experience I mostly had fun with, it just fell to pieces at the end. It really ended the entire experience on a sour note. Coming in at number 3, however, next up we've got Rise of the Ronin. This game saw its PC release in 2025, and as a PC channel, that's obviously of interest to me, and I play a lot of what Team Ninja puts out, so I wanted to jump in and take a look at this thing. And as is their hallmark, the combat was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the combat systems of this game a lot, but unfortunately, with it being like their first foray into a more like open world type of game, you could really see that they lacked some experience on that front, with a lot of systems that just never came together or cooperated with each other. They also tried to do like this choice and consequence thing with you like siding with different factions throughout the story, but then it kind of just doesn't matter and there were no consequences to any of that. And I guess if I had to put it succinctly, Rise of the Ronin feels like a first draft of a bigger concept. Like, there are some good ideas there, but I don't think any of them really ever come properly to fruition, which left me with great combat, but unfortunately not a lot enjoyable otherwise. Though the good news being, I suppose, that if you really just enjoy the combat, it is very good on that front. Coming in at number 4, we then have Assassin's Creed Shadows. A game I went into hoping to enjoy quite a lot, which may very well be the reason I found it so disappointing, and that is because I had not played an Assassin's Creed game in a very long time, like since 2 basically. With this one being set in Japan and everything, I was like, oh cool, this is the one where I can jump back into it and kind of see what the franchise has been up to, and unfortunately it was almost like a bit of a culture shock in some ways, because I didn't realize just how bad some of this stuff had gotten with like the way they're doing like in-game monetization for a game you've already got to pay for. And while I can get over that stuff, once you start looking at the actual gameplay, you've got the dynamic of having to play either Yasuke or Naoe, and Naoe's gameplay is kind of what I was looking for. An assassin going around, and in my case at least, depending on your options, you don't necessarily have to do this, but like maximizing your assassinations by, causing them to take more and more health segments away from a target, which led to like all these upgrades and stuff where you could lean fully into trying to get Naoe to a point where she could seamlessly assassinate somebody that you're after. And of course, the stealth gameplay associated with that was stuff that I had a good time with. And Yasuke, while a pretty good power fantasy, just kind of felt like he was from a different game altogether, being himself kind of just an unstoppable killing machine, which is fun in its own way, but it just wasn't really like the experience that I had signed up for. And I think I summed it up pretty well in my review for this game actually, which was that the stuff that I wanted to do was the assassin gameplay with Naoe, but that was basically surrounded by like a bunch of different systems that were just not things I wanted to do, which led to, of course, the disappointment. Keeping it moving, however, we then have the disappointing release of Neverwinter Nights 2's Enhanced Edition, which was a bit of an odd one because, on one hand, I think Neverwinter Nights 2 does a lot of really cool things that if you're into CRPGs is definitely worth your time to check out. And yet, this Enhanced Edition that they put out in July, they being Aspire Media to be clear, but this version of the game is essentially the old version of the game for slightly more money. Now, realistically, what they were doing here was adding things like full controller support, a slight upgrade to the graphics, and that was pretty much it, and threw it out on consoles and stuff. And while I can appreciate a game being available in more places, they tried to bill this as like a big enhanced edition, as the title would imply, and unfortunately it just really fails to live up to that. I believe I said in my review, if they fixed a single bug here, I couldn't tell you what it was. Some of the restored multiplayer functionality was nice, but at least on launch, even that wasn't fully, properly done the way they said it was going to be, with persistent worlds not being able to be accessed. I still don't know if they fixed that. But basically, bringing the whole thing together, unless you just really wanted to play this game with a controller, it really didn't do anything that wasn't already available, and the graphical improvement wasn't so much as to be super required or anything. In fact, it was barely altered. If you compare super close, there's an upgrade there, but it's very hard to see. And so for PC players at least, It was basically just controller support and being able to play it on Steam Deck without a huge hassle, and paying $10 more for that from the version of the game you could already get and do basically the same stuff with, it's just a real bummer, to be honest. The entire release felt a lot more like a small patch than it did a proper enhanced edition, which was, as you would imagine, for a guy who loves CRPGs, very disappointing, especially since the game itself, Neverwinter Nights 2, is a ton of fun and worth people's time. Keeping it moving though, second from the end, we've then got Mafia The Old Country. The definition of a mixed bag, because on one hand, its short story is pretty good. I enjoyed it a lot, but it kind of feels like it would have been a better movie than a proper game, because the game is essentially just a basic cover shooter for most of it. There's some stealth action in there, and then that's kind of it, which gives this open world area that they give you to run around in a really, really empty feeling. It's almost basically pointless, to the point where it kind of feels like they had planned for a lot more and then it just had to be cut and the game shipped at some point. After launch, they said they were going to address this with what they were calling free ride mode, which was a reason to explore the actual open world that they put in here for seemingly no reason otherwise. But that has yet to materialize, and as a result, without it, you're left with this sort of open world title that just has a short but good story and really nothing else going on. Everything else about it is a very generic kind of cover shooter that you've likely played a million of, and it was just very disappointing. And like I said, I would be very surprised if there wasn't a lot more content planned that just had to be cut for whatever reason, because it really feels like you're playing the bones of something that was meant to be a lot bigger. Which brings us to our final and most recent entry with Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. And this is an interesting one because I don't think anybody went into Bloodlines 2 really expecting, after everything that game had been through, an absolute blockbuster or whatever. I think the absolute most sensible approach to that game was to treat it with some skepticism, given its lengthy development hell. And to that end, if you want to be sensible about it, I don't think Bloodlines 2 is terrible or anything. I think if you're willing to put aside the fact that it's meant to be Bloodlines 2 and not really a sequel to Bloodlines 1, then it's a perfectly serviceable action adventure. But the thing about names is that, especially with video game titles and the implications of something being a sequel, is that that inherently comes with expectations. And while I went into this game very much expecting the worst, honestly, after everything it had been through, part of me still hoped for an actual sequel to Bloodlines 1, or even, a actual RPG, as this one isn't really an RPG in my opinion. It's a nice little action adventure that's fun enough for what it is, but a sequel to Bloodlines 1, it is not. Outside of, its naming convention, obviously, but if I were to try to summarize it quickly, it would just be that the focus is on all the things that aren't, super important for an RPG. Like, for instance, your clan choice. That's basically just a flavor of combat. It hardly ever comes up in the actual story outside of a couple lines of dialogue. Most aren't even chosen, or dialogues that you can choose, rather. Most of them are just one-off comments by the person speaking to you. There are a couple of dialogues that are specific to your clan that you can actually choose, but that's basically it as far as differences between the clans go. There's not much reason to explore the admittedly very atmospheric world they built here, and then there's the sort of jankiness of the way the masquerade system works, the interactions between the different people that you can potentially feed on, like the cops shooting immediately somebody who is angry that you're trying to get a specific type of blood resonance from, as opposed to allowing you to chase an entirely different type of blood resonance all through the city while that person is actively screaming for help and nobody cares. And then with the masquerade side of that, you might think that's an issue, but as I mentioned, it's janky and doesn't really work all that well, because you can effectively break the masquerade as many times as you want. As long as the meter doesn't top out, it really doesn't matter. And honestly, I could go on, but I think you get the gist. I wanted a sequel, and while this is an okay game, it's not really a sequel. But that, I think, is where we're going to properly wrap up this video. There's been the games I've reviewed in 2025 that weren't quite up to my expectations as it would happen. And while normally this is where I ask people, to comment about something similar, but honestly, reading through a bunch of comments about games people found disappointing is a real bummer for me personally at the end of the day when I go through them. So feel free to throw in some games that exceeded your expectations, or maybe even like a random mechanic you loved in an otherwise underwhelming game. But realistically, that's just a fancy way of saying like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.